The second half of this diesel engine disassembly really answered the last of the remaining questions that I had regarding the backstory of that old 1941 Caterpillar D2, and it tells a rather sad story, to be honest with you. Hey everybody, welcome back to the show. Part 2 of the Cat D3400 diesel engine teardown. Parts engine, I should add. And we're down to the meat and potatoes of it now. This is where you always hope to find still usable components, the rotating assembly. A lot of that stuff is quickly becoming unobtainium. So I've spent the morning pulling cotter pins from all the rods and the mains, taking bolts out of the front cover. We've got that piece ready to come off. Let's dive into it. And more nests. Nice. Now I'll pull the idler gear off its shaft, and that should unlock the rest of the gear train because the crankshaft isn't about to spin. Check and see. Yep, cam spins. So we can rotate it around and access the thrust plate bolts through these openings in the gear. Get those out of there. We'll pull the cam next. And so far on the cam, just some light water staining, and the lobes are even polishing up just with this shop rag. So not too worried right there. I think we salvaged a camshaft, and I've also got the accessory drive hub and idler hub loose. Same deals with the camshaft. You go in through these windows in the gear, and you got to get to 3 bolts and 3 fold-over locks on there. 3 bolts, 3 fold-over locks on that hub. They come out as one piece because you've got this oil line joins them together. Intermediate cover comes off next. Alright, we're loosening main caps now. So up next, we'll start seeing what bearings and crankshaft look like. That one's tight. There we go. Probably had to give that one the extra cinch to get that cotter pin to line up. Okay, everybody, I pulled all the caps because once I started putting the wrench on things, oh, the clunking. Put it this way, we're beyond even plastic gauging. We can just use the wonky eyeball, get a pretty good idea. So, boy, did we find things. Start with the mains, all right? So, the mains, the bearing parts actually look pretty good. But, let's get here to the front when you can see it even better. Like, bearing's not bad, but wear on the crankshaft, the center where that oil groove is in the bearing, that is a very, very high spot yet. I know you can see it. And even out here, outside of where the bearing is on the journal, another huge pronounced step. You don't just catch those with your fingernail, you could break a fingernail on those. So, I don't know what's going on here yet. Did they put new bearings on a completely worn out crank? I just don't know. Pulling the others, same way. Look at that ridge that goes right down the center of that journal, that main journal. Center thrust. Yeah, and it only measured like 10 thousandths in thrust, which I thought was not bad, but then I could not believe the amount of journal wear we had there. So rods, same way. Number 2 right here. You can actually see gap between the bearing and the journal, and it's got an even larger step in the center than the mains. That's at least 20 thousandths wear. Material just gone off the crankshaft. So, yeah, I'm just going to pull this out. We'll do a quick caliper mic to the crank, figure out how badly it's worn. Crank is ruined. I can tell you that right now. And I might just pop some caps on and just do a quick bearing ID measurement. That'll give me an idea whether or not the bearings are worn as badly as the crank. Yeah, let's pull it and see. And here it is the next day. I spent the morning this morning building a tool. You'll see it in just a minute. So yeah, yesterday evening I was out here. I did a few rough measurements. It looks like the main bearings were running around the 40 thousandths mark for clearance. I think I'm starting to piece another backstory together about what happened when they replaced this engine block, but I need a few more details from the top end first. So crankshaft is over there. Yeah, it's one of the worst ones I've ever seen, but I'm still holding out hope for pistons. All right. It's evident we're not going to get any bottom end like bearing parts or anything out of this at all. But I'll tell you, those connecting rods, without being able to measure anything, there is just no detectable play in those. And the pistons, I still say look like they're new. So maybe they did a top end rebuild at the time that they replaced the block, since they would have to change liners anyhow. But maybe they put some new bearings on a worn out crankshaft. Oh man, I don't know. And now the tool setup that I mentioned, spending the morning putting together, that's everything right here. We've got the OTC 17.5 ton small hollow ram with the hand pump unit. And the best way to try to push these piston rod liner assemblies out, instead of anchoring to the oil pan block flange, I decided it was much stronger if I could get down on these main bearing saddles. All right, get that front cap off. That's kind of a tight fit. This is by far your strongest section of the block right here. So I decided to use these studs and those machined mounts. Now look at the first 4 main bearing caps. They don't have near the bulk that the rear main does. That they even put that puller hole in there. You saw me removing it yesterday with the bar puller because it's just so heavy duty. There is a lot of material in that thing. And luckily, I've disassembled quite a few of these engine blocks. I still had 2 of them down there that have not found their way to the scrapyard yet. So I pulled the rear main bearing housing off of each one of them. And I had to stamp them so that I'd know. I chose the one off of the original 5J1113 engine block that had frozen. That was completely shot, and because these are line bored to each block, once the block is bad, these caps are bad as well. So I'm like, let's make tools out of them. So that's the old 1113 rear main. This is 3J2219. You know who that is? That's beer can D2. In fact, that's the rear main shell with the old Blatz light can that came out of that bearing cap. So what I did, I drilled and tapped each one for an auxiliary 5/8 by 18 threaded hole. Okay, you see where I just centered it up between the through holes for the mounting studs. Boom, popped a threaded hole right in each one of them. There's the other one. That will allow these puller legs to thread right in and anchor to them. And because all of these main bearing saddles were machined the same way, I can take these old rear main caps, I can place them anywhere I want up and down the line. They all fit. So we can take full advantage of all the finely machined tolerances. Everything fits nice and tight. We can just utilize the old main bearing castle nuts, get everything tightened down. Now we have a perfect anchor for the puller legs. Next is this heavy steel block. I need this because I can't put the hollow ram directly on the bottom of the rod because it has that little alignment peg. So I made sure there were no burrs on either side because we don't want to damage that bottom surface of the connecting rod. But that fits on there very well, avoids that little peg, gives us a nice platform for the hollow ram. And finally, we put the hollow ram in place on top of our block. And I've got the 17.5 ton mechanical straight bar puller. That's going to go in on top of the ram. And the threaded nut and washer are only acting as a spacer right now. That way the ram can come up, tighten up against the bar. It doesn't have to move so far. It doesn't have to be so much travel. So also that forcing screw goes down through the center of the ram, kind of acts as a centering guide as well. Make sure everything gets, or everything stays lined up. So finish putting the clamps on the puller legs and we'll start the push. And we're barely pushing 3 ton on the gauge. I can see that liner dropping already now. We're not in like danger pressure territory here, so I'm gonna hold on to the ram because when that finally disengages from the block, I don't want this to drop. I want to protect that line and that fitting. So I'm just gonna keep this under control, and we're barely even registering on the gauge. That liner's drifting right out. I'd say we're just about out. Yep, there we are. Dropped out right there. So we've got one down. Pushed it right on through. There it is out the top. So now we leapfrog the bearing caps. And that's, I guess, the one kind of tedious part of this setup, because these rear mains are so wide, they have to offset to the one side. So that means, and yeah, these front ones are a tight fit, even with the regular cap. That means you have to reset between every hole. I guess that's not really the end of the world. So, all right, we'll do it again. And we're climbing. That's about our 3 ton mark. About 4. Yeah, it is starting to move, so pretty similar to the other one. Going easier now. There it's out. Now I leapfrogged all the way back to cylinder number 4. I couldn't push number 3 next because cylinder 4 stopped toward the bottom of the liner. That makes the connecting rod stick up too high to be able to overhang the blocks into that bay. I also couldn't cant the rod one way or the other and get it to clear them. But the beauty of these blocks is it doesn't matter where any of these pistons stopped. You can start by pushing the tall one out first, all right? That's what we did on number 1. It was sticking up high. We got that out of the way. 2 and 3 were both recessed in quite a bit, so I could move to number 2, work just fine. So we basically have to start from the other end now and work back toward the center. So we'll push number 4, finish up with 3. There, started moving at about 4 ton again. Moving easy now. Well, that was a nice surprise. I didn't know it was the piston moving. It broke loose at about 4 ton and pushed accordingly, just like the first 2 liners. I couldn't see it either from my vantage point at the hand pump because I had the camera in this block window right here. I wanted to get some good footage of that liner moving out, and kind of glad I decided to throw the camera down there on number 4 because that piston moves. So I'm taking that as good news. So I just stopped. I don't want to grind it through all that rusty cylinder wall up above the crown. So we're set up on number 3. Let's see if we can push number 3. There, we're down. Now let's see how crooked this is because we're a little bit heavier at the back with number 4 still being in there. Now we're moving up. There it is. And here we are again, the next day. This salvage work takes quite a lot longer than just disassembly, but I think our efforts are starting to pay off. So last night, after I removed that last stuck piston, I filled the remaining stuck liners with evapor rust. They soaked like that all night. I just cleaned this one out a few minutes ago. It cleaned it up pretty well. We'll start working on that one shortly. I also looked at the piston I was able to drive out, and yeah, it was pretty dirty when it came out of the liner, but a quick cleaning in the solvent pan, tell you what, it doesn't look bad. And I mic'd the entire body. I can detect about 1/1000th wear on the outside of that piston. So very, very low hour pistons in this. The oil control rings show minimal wear. Compression rings, well, it does have a good chrome one in the top. They're a little bit harder to assess. We'll probably end up boiling this one to try to get those rings freed up. But the piston pin, excellent condition. Pin bushing, excellent condition. You don't even have a detectable click in there. It's just a really nice tight slip fit. So definitely we're striking some pay dirt with this top end. I had some pretty high hopes for that bottom end and crankshaft, but those were all dashed. So that's encouraging. It tells me what I need to do to start freeing some of these up. So let's take this one outside, see if we can't get some movement. Heating the liner will start to expand it, okay? And this will work up to a certain point, because eventually when the aluminum piston inside starts to heat up, it will expand at a greater rate than the liner. But expansion and contraction is the first step toward initiating movement. That is where it all begins. We can watch up inside. We can also watch down on the bottom. We should start cooking out any residual moisture or oil. We're starting to see bubbles. Bit of a boiling action. All of that is working to break those rust bonds. I think we've got 4 really good pistons here if we can keep the set intact. Liners are disposable. Pistons are basically unobtainium, so you know where my priority lies here. Heat also amplifies the capillary action of penetrating oils. Use plenty. Here at Sizzling, now we just let it sit, completely cool. There, I just about dropped it out on the ground. This was 4 hot to cold cycles. I got it moving with the wood block and the hammer at first. As you can see here, it just dropped out on its own. So that's how I like to do it. Minimal stress on things. It was very rusty, but yeah, that works. I've got the other 2 out here as well. This one's been through 2 hot to cold cycles, this one just a single. And they've both cooled down to the point where you can touch them again now. And I don't get anything here red, just enough to start boiling the penetrating oil from around the circumference of the piston. That's when you know everything is starting to wick through. We've got expansion and contraction. It's starting to initiate movement. So we'll just keep throwing these through heating cycles, see how long it takes. Okay, everybody, we're down to 2, and I have not been able to get either of these to move with the hammer and the block. They've each been put through about 10 hot to cold cycles. So my next step is the most invasive, but I've done it before. We'll take this angle grinder with the cutoff wheel, and we will split the liner off of the piston. You just need to be very careful that you don't cut through and hit the piston, okay? So what we can do here is we can cut all the way through at the top and all the way through for a little ways at the bottom, and then carefully score in a line between those two. So just pay attention to what you're doing. Make sure you don't go too deep. If you cut into the piston, now you've just wrecked the piston too. And you might be asking, why don't I just press these? I like to avoid pressing stuck pistons. These in particular, because they're so irregularly shaped at the top. We've got a hole, we've got a high spot, you'd be putting tons of stress on two main areas, and I'd just rather avoid all of that. And here is our finished result. We're cut through at the top, cut through at, come on, there we can see it at the bottom. And we are probably 2/3 of the way through, all the way in between. Next, I'll take a chisel, start driving it down. I also ground in a little bit of a lead in, kind of a V-notch right there, so we can get that in a little ways at first. If this one doesn't do it, we'll jump up to larger and larger ones as we go. Now, risk of shatter. This is just like a bearing race, okay? It's kind of a hardened sleeve, so hardened liner, I should say. So anytime you're going to split something, there is the risk of shatter. Gloves, I'll have a face shield. There is no shame in protecting yourself. So let's see how difficult this one's going to be. Usually they don't split too bad once you got them scored this deep. Yeah, a little bit of a crack starting right there. There. We split it all the way. I heard it pop. And we all know how much GoPros love the close-ups. They don't at all, actually. But yeah, clearly visible crack line. Runs all the way up. You can see it right through there, off the end of my finger. And yes, we can still see it up in here. It does start to diminish a little bit by the time we get to the very top. It is a hairline crack by the time we get up there. I'll probably drive another chisel up here, and that'll just split it the rest of the way. It'll pop easy at this point. Once we get that spread, we should be able to knock that piston out. Yeah, that opened it right up. Getting our first look at a very rusty piston. Yep, see the rings? A lot of brown rust in between. There we are. Well, everybody, it's finally fully apart, and although it took several days longer than I had originally planned, the second half of this diesel engine disassembly really answered the last of the remaining questions that I had regarding the backstory of that old 1941 Caterpillar D2, and it tells a rather sad story, to be honest with you. It's a situation that I also saw play out numerous times throughout the years as a mechanic in the Ford dealer. So we learned in the last episode that the cooling system likely froze on their original block, cracking it, causing them to replace it with this much later block as well as that much later cylinder head, but we weren't sure how many other pieces were replaced at the time. Now we know. So starting from the top, assessing the cylinder head, it's a very low hour unit, all right? The fact that you can still see that noticeable step around the valve seats tells me that's original factory grind. Now, we've got some rust pitting happening on these back two cylinders. The good part is I've put much worse back in service, and I can refresh all of these seats with my seat grinder without having to have any inserts put in. The valves also show very few hours of operation. There's not even a seat worn around that face. There is nowhere to the stems. There is nowhere on the guides. A couple of these have been taken out of action due to excessive rust pitting, but there are several good usable pieces here, and all the guides are fully intact. And the injector that was still in the cylinder head. When I pulled valves and springs, I was able to turn the whole thing out. And originally I thought the nut had been like stuck to the body because the whole thing wanted to spin. Well, it turns out the pre-combustion chambers are like brand new inside the cylinder head with no rust around the upper area, no corrosion on the threads, and it was still tight in the pre-com chamber. It was just turning the whole chamber out with it. I've never seen a D2 pre-combustion chamber that looked new like this. Typically, they're so rusted and pitted, we're worried about them leaking coolant into the cylinder. And you remember when I was doing the 5J1113 rebuild, those were so rusted in, I had a 12-foot long cheater pipe on the wrench that engages with these, trying to do chin-ups, trying to make them turn out. So yeah, likely the other 3 pre-coms in this head are just as good. So those are 4 very, very nice pieces to have. Working on down to pistons now. We have 4 very nice condition, very low hour pistons. Like I said, they mic about 1/1000th wear around the whole outside skirt, and a little bit of discoloration at the top. That is not a big deal, and we can clean these some more. I just kind of got the worst of the stuff off, and they've just about all got stuck rings. All right, only a couple of them had the lower oil controls free up like that. That's not a big deal. One trick is to take an aluminum piston like this, boil it in hot water for about 5 to 10 minutes. Those rings will just about pop off on their own. So very little wear. Wrist pins are all good. And these are the later style one-piece pistons. These are not the original two-piece style that had the thread-on crown that would sometimes back itself off and start to come apart and then bend valves and push rods and hit the head and cause all kinds of damage. So all of the work that we put into taking this engine apart was well worth those 4 pieces right there. That is pure unobtainium. And the rings, like I said, also looked very good, although they're stuck. The liners were new as well, with visible factory crosshatch still up into the lower area of the piston ring travel. So my guess is this ran just long enough to seat these rings, and that was about it. So everything with that prior rebuild is excellent up to this point. They went all new on the whole top end. They used quality pieces. It was all put together correctly. But now we get to the crankshaft. And this is where the whole job failed. The profound amount of wear on all those journals, both the mains and the rods. The horrendous running clearance I found in the rod bearings and the mains. The measurements I got from these pieces are what really tell the rest of the story of this engine. Now, without going too deep down the rabbit hole, here are all of my measurements, and we'll start with the crankshaft. Main journals, they began life at 2.750 inch diameter, and I found from 24 to 28 thousandths worth of wear on all those mains. That's metal that's just been wiped off of that crankshaft. They're also running about 10 thousandths out of round. And rod journals should be 2.625 inch. Well, they were worn from 34 to 43 thousandths with about a 15 thousandths out of round. To put that into context, maximum allowable wear and out of roundness is only 7 thousandths. And looking at bearings, the mains all had from 11 to 13 thousandths wear on them, and the rod bearings were from 7 thousandths all the way up to 22, and I still haven't been able to account for that because it gets progressively worse as you go back from cylinder 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. Whatever the case, running clearance on the mains was from 37 to 39 thousandths. Running clearance on the rods was 42 all the way up to 65 thousandths. And to put that into context, 3 thousandths to 5 thousandths is your desired running clearance. But the real tell here is in how these bearings are worn, especially when compared to the wear that's on the crankshaft. So here's your bearing setup. You got the 2 halves, make a hole, and you measure these in 2 directions. So you have the thrust surfaces up top and down below. That's the first direction you measure because you expect to see most of your wear top to bottom. Then you reference that with the measurement side to side. This is opposite of thrust, and you will see less wear on the sides, but you still should see some. Now, everything that has a star in front of it in this first column, that indicates the diameter of a brand new bearing. And those measurements were taken opposite of thrust from here to here on the mains and from there to there on the rods. But then when I measured in the direction of the thrust, that is where you started seeing all the wear. which would be from here down to there, both on the mains and on the rods, top to bottom. So we've got brand new bearing clearances side to side, all right? But they're completely worn out, top to bottom. And taking into consideration that bearings are softer than crankshaft, so bearings should wear more than crankshaft, yet all of these bearings show roughly 50% of the wear that their corresponding crankshaft journals show. That tells me they put brand new bearings on a completely worn out crankshaft at the time of that last rebuild. So if they would have replaced the crankshaft and had perfectly round journals with perfectly round bearings at the proper clearance, the oil pump has no problem maintaining an oil barrier between all those metal surfaces. So no actual metal to metal contact occurs, and that's why engines can run so long before they start to wear. But you take a worn crankshaft with out of round or egg-shaped journals and put a new perfectly round bearing on that, well, the oil pump can no longer maintain that oil barrier between the various metals. So you've got wide clearances that let a lot of that oil barrier leak right out. Egg-shaped crank journals have high spots, which have then no trouble punching through what's left of the oil barrier. That creates metal-on-metal contact, which creates more wear, which leaks more oil. It's a compounding scenario. So because we've got bottom end bearings that are perfectly round opposite of thrust, or perfectly sized opposite of thrust, but worn way out in the direction of the thrust, and a completely trashed crankshaft, to me that just seals the deal. So knowing all of that, why would they have made that decision in the first place? To answer that question, I'll go back to Walter Matson's comment under the prior episode where he asks, do you know how much a replacement block would have cost back when this one was purchased? And luckily I've got this Caterpillar parts price list from August 1954 that lists everything that was current at that time, and it just took a few minutes to go through the old D2 parts books to find the part numbers for the major items that we know they replaced new, and we can get the 1954 costs for all of those pieces. So we take our new engine block casting that we know they replaced, the new cylinder head casting, 4 pistons, 4 pre-combustion chambers. Those are just the big ticket items that we know they did, and pretend that all happened around 1954. So we start off with the engine block, first item. That was $280.91 back then. Adjusted for inflation in 2024 US dollars, $3,300 today. Yeah, just for that engine block. And cylinder head was $74 back then. That works out to $879 now. Pistons were $21 each back then, and that's $250 a pop today, and that's only one of them. We need 4 to do the engine. Pre-combustion chambers were $15 back then. That works out to $183 now. Again, we need 4 of them. That's just for one. So, yeah, times 4 for both of those items. Add that up. We're just shy of $6,000 right now, and we haven't figured in valves, gaskets, seals, bottom end bearings. Equipment's always been expensive. Now, getting to the crankshaft, Caterpillar only offered 30 thousandths undersized bearings for these D2s. That's all well and good if you can pull off a 15 thousandths grind around the entire perimeter of the crank. 15 on this side, 15 on that side. There's your 30 under. That's already worn more than 15, so that crankshaft was not savable. So a new crankshaft would have been another $120 back in the day. That would have added $1,420 onto an already high tally. I think they got to a point with it where they just ran out of money and just had to say, we have to quit. So they made it run, but in my estimation, looking at the limited amount of wear on the top side, they probably got 100 hours out of this before the bottom end just got so bad that they had to park it, and perhaps that's why it was so neglected and ended up full of water, and they just had to throw their hands in the air and walk away. And as I alluded to earlier, that's a scenario that I personally watched play out numerous times throughout the years as a mechanic at the Ford dealer, trying to get vehicles up and running again for people. They could be faced with a catastrophic repair that they weren't planning on and didn't really have the budget for, but they've got a broken machine that's no good to sell, so they can't afford to fix it, but they can't afford not to at the same time. So they go as far as they can really go. And if you're 3/4 of the way there, you've spent yourself into a scenario where you pretty much have to get to the finish line to protect the investment that you've put in up to that point. And sometimes it's just not possible. And it ends up being a very, very bad situation. So, all right, I think that rounds out the entire backstory of the Mystery D2 engine. There's some very good things, there's some very bad things, but I think it had a story to tell, and it told it well. So I thank you, everyone, for watching. I hope this was an interesting 2-part engine teardown series. We've delved into some history and found out some interesting things, and there was high points, low points, and made some discoveries along the way, and we'll add to the parts pile, let others live on. All right, everyone, I'll let you all go. Hope to see you back next time.